Well, welcome to Just Taking Luck Out of Your Pictures. I'm Tom Kliner, and a friend of mine suggested that maybe I show off a little bit about some of the area that I live in, because it is quite beautiful, and give you an idea of what my inspiration for my photography is. What I'm doing right now with the video is I'm panning. It's broken, so it might be a little bit shaky, but I'm using a very low ISO setting, which gives me the highest quality available. And it is an HD video camera, but still, the quality settings do make a difference. I've got the aperture set as small as it will go on this particular unit, so it's a larger number in the aperture setting. And what that's doing is it's giving me more in focus. And for things like this, where you're shooting a landscape type of scene, that's generally the chosen type of setting. See, it is a very beautiful place. That's the downtown area right there in the top part of the screen. And let me just slow down here for a second, and let's see if we can find the bridge right there in the center. And this is a new bridge, and yet part of it still does remain floating. Anyway, I do love where I live, and I hope you'll stick with me through this series of videos. I'm going to have to move from this location because I can't control the sound, and we're going to head out lakeshore just a little bit. But as I pan back, I just want to show you what I'm looking at every day, because where I'm looking at that from, as soon as we get around here, I'll speed up a little bit. Hope that's not hard on anybody's stomach. And we're coming on my house right pretty soon. And right here you see the mountain that looks like a sleeping giant. There's an itty bitty little patch up there, and that's where I live. I get to look out at this every day, all the seasons, all the different types of weather patterns, and I get to motorcycle around here with my camera and take pictures. There's some wonderful, wonderful nature shots, and like I said, this is my inspiration, and hope you enjoy the rest of the series. Your digital camera comes with a lot of settings on it and different ways to do so. You're going to have a dial, you're going to have the menu on the back side, several other options as well. It will have an automatic setting. Your consumer models are going to have presets like sports and portrait and backlighting and stuff like that. A lot of the newer ones now in particular will have extra presets for things like fish tanks and fisheye and doing fireworks and that. So there's still an automatic function, but they do help you kind of narrow down your field of what you're trying to do. And what you'll find is that it also has the settings that are on some of the professional cameras. Not all of them, but quite a few of them. It'll have your program mode, it'll have an aperture mode, it'll have a shutter speed, it'll have a manual mode. Now when you do move into, and it'll also probably have a built-in flash. When you start going away from the consumer model and you get into the professional model, and don't mind the lens, I brought this out here just because of where I am, you'll find that you're going to probably have a bigger screen. You're going to have another screen up here that you can use. The buttons on the backs and tops are going to be far more functional. The dial itself, I'll bring this a little bit closer just for the moment. And you'll notice the dial here does not have the picture of the sports mode with the running man, running stick man, and it won't have a portrait picture on it and stuff like that. As I figure by the time you get here, you got a pretty good idea what you're doing, or at least you're willing to learn how to do it. The other thing that these do have is that, as well as the manual setting, is it will have a bulb setting, and that's for leaving the shutter open as long as you wish. You typically would do that with a remote type timer. Those are great for night shots and stuff like that. You'll also find that the automatic, it does have an automatic section, selection. And this is what I do when I hand the camera over to somebody else to take a picture. And it also has a few selections where you can preset different settings. If you're doing standard type events, you might be able to use those. Myself, I never have. You're also going to find that this is where the DSLR comes in. So it's a digital single lens reflex, and that very basically means that you take the lens off, it's a single type, and then you would exchange it with whatever else you want to use. They come with a lot of different settings on them as well, where you can change your focus from auto to manual. You can change the stabilizer mode. You might be able to change the distance of what it focuses at. Anyway, let's not get tied up on that right now. Let's work on some of the settings, because the whole intention of this video is to get you off of automatic, take that luck out of your picture, and get you to be able to set your camera the way you want it to take the pictures that you want, right? So first off, let's start off with talking about some of the selections that are on the dial of your camera, like sports and portrait and night shot and whatnot. And they will actually in turn kind of help you understand what the other side of the dial does. Briefly, sports mode is that little running man that's usually on the dial, and what that's going to do is it's going to take the shutter speed as a priority, because you're telling it you're doing sports, which is action, so you want to stop that a little bit quicker. It's going to also change your autofocus so that as you're pushing the button halfway down, it's going to continuously focus on the object that you're following. So if you've got somebody or something coming towards you, like changing a distance, the focus motor will continue to follow that. These are good for fast moving scenes. So your aperture and your ISO are going to be set automatically by the camera, and your shutter speed will vary as to what it thinks will be good. So if you've got lots of light, it may give you 1/1000th of a second for your shutter speed. If your light's starting to reduce and it decides it wants to maintain quality, it may bring your shutter speed down to 2/100th of a second. Is that fast enough? Too slow? Well, that's up to you to decide. Your landscape setting is typically going to give you more blues, more greens. The focus will be set on a one shot, so that wherever you point it, that's what it's going to focus at. It's going to give you a smaller aperture, which is the larger number if you remember from the previous video. And what that smaller aperture is going to do is it's going to increase the depth of field and put more of your photo in focus, which is typically what we like for a landscape type photo. The night scenes. Now this is going to adjust accordingly for flash or no flash, depending on your camera. It's probably going to give you a higher ISO setting so that the shutter speed can keep up. And it's going to give you the largest aperture opening that it can accommodate with the other two settings. This will mean a shallower depth of field, but it does allow more light in more quickly so that you will get a better night shot. The backlight setting on your dial is going to affect more than how the camera meters the light that's coming in. So what it's thinking is that you have a lot of light around your subject, and so it's going to narrow the degree that it measures the light, which probably is something like on my face, and so therefore the background may become overexposed, but the subject matter itself is going to give you a proper exposure, hopefully. What the other settings are going to do depends on what the little computerization inside your camera determines. It may determine that you have a landscape type setting to go with it. It may determine you have a sports type setting or a portrait type setting. I don't know. The portrait setting on the dial, that's the one with the picture or caricature of a person's face that's on the dial. Probably the most purposely selected setting on your digital camera. A reason for that is that when we take a person's portrait, we want to show them how good we are. We're going to hand this photo to another one of our fellow human beings. It is probably the one that makes us most feel like a photographer, because it gives us that nice warm feeling. It gives us nice warm colors. It gives us that fuzzy background. It concentrates on a person. And typically when you're doing a portrait, you're trying to get an expression or a feeling from that person. What the camera does is it will help soften the focus. That way you don't get the harsh blemishes, which unfortunately most of us do have. It is going to help warm the colors so that the person looks a little more alive, so your flesh tones are going to be nicer, the temperature is going to be softer, going to be warmer. It is going to open the aperture probably as wide as it can go. It depends on your camera, depends on your lighting situation, of course. And by opening the aperture as wide as it can, it's going to give you a very shallow depth of field. And depending on your distance from the camera, that's what's going to give you that nice, soft, blurry background. And frankly, we don't care about the background. And the blur is nice in most portraits because what we want to see is the person's face. Again, we want to capture that moment, we want to capture that expression. Flash on this setting is typically an option because using a portrait and a straight-on flash right off the camera will often make your picture look very flat. And that's what they call flat lighting because it's direct and it takes away a lot of the shadows and stuff that give us depth on our two-dimensional photo. Anyway, that's kind of what the dial, what the one side of the dial on your camera will do. And hopefully, like I said, this will make some of the rest of it make a little more sense. Alright, the other side of the dial. Now, this is where you really start to get control of your camera. Now, I know there's a lot of people out there that tell you, my friend says, I gotta shoot in manual. If you don't shoot in full manual, manual focus, manual settings, manual this, manual everything, you're not a real photographer. I don't know a lot of real photographers that shoot everything in manual. If you have the time to set things up and you have control over your environment and your environment isn't continually changing on you, like if you're shooting a sporting event and you happen to be shooting at one end where they're in the shade and the next end they're in the sunlight, and then as they get across the field, you know, you may have a great big white wall behind them or something. Well, if you're that good and you can shoot somebody running down the field or a car racing down there and keep changing your manual settings and get it perfect every time, good on you. But I don't know a lot of people that can really do that, so don't let those guys fool you. Well, the reason to use the settings on the other side of the dial are because you're now starting to understand how it all comes together, how the settings affect your photography. You're now looking at what it is that is your priority for your picture and how you want it to turn out. For instance, if you're shooting a sporting event, and they're all going to be different, and your selection, of course, is going to be different. You know, if you're shooting a tennis match and you want to catch the ball in action, you're going to need a really, really fast shutter speed and a really good eye for focusing. If you happen to be shooting a curling match, well, it's still a sport, but it's much slower and your shutter priority is going to be a lot less, okay? If you want to do something like maybe you're doing a wakeboarding event or water skiing, your shutter speed is going to be determined by what you want for a photograph. Do you want, when the skier goes by and the spray comes up, do you want all the water droplets stopped fast in the air? Or do you want to have a nice smooth blur? This goes for waterfalls and other things as well. So your shutter speed or time value are going to be the choice that you want to make with that. Okay? Your aperture value, or A or AV, depending on your camera, you'll select the size of the aperture opening to get the desired depth of field or to accommodate the amount of light that you have. The camera must then select the shutter speed for a proper exposure. But again, your priority is based on the amount of light or the depth of field. So this is why you would use an aperture value. You set your ISO accordingly because you understand what the ISO does now about how it collects light quickly. Or pardon me, how it records light quickly. The P, or the program mode, to me is absolutely the most useless selection on the dial. What it does is it basically leaves your camera in automatic, but it allows you to change the focus setting, whether you want it to be on one shot so that it just, you know, point, lock, and shoot at that focus, whether you go to what I was talking about in the sports mode, where you can, it's called a servo, and you push the button down on your subject, and as you follow it, the focus will change to keep them in focus. And then there's a third setting, which is the what they call artificial intelligence. And what that does is, much like any other automatic setting, the camera decides on what it's focused on and what it's going to follow, not follow, do whatever. Anyway, now that you've learned how to use the shutter speed, the aperture modes, and we're going to go into manual soon, program is just kind of why. Excellent. So manual, the one that everybody brags about and says, ooh, you're not a photographer unless you're using manual. That is not entirely true, as I mentioned. but it does give you a really good handle on your camera, on your settings, on your situation. And once you start to practice with the aperture and shutter speed and whatnot, it will help you to understand how you're going to set your manual settings, because you don't just turn it on manual and get a picture. You have to kind of have a good understanding of what your exposure level is going to be at, which is your ISO in this case, what your aperture opening is going to be at, and what shutter speed it is to give you a properly exposed picture, going back to the exposure triangle. You know, say if you're in a portrait shoot situation where you are in a studio, you have control of the lighting, you have control of the entire situation. Your model is probably not going to be running on a bicycle, but if they are, you're going to know how to change the setting. If you're shooting a concert and you've got crazy lighting and you know you don't want to rely on the camera's internal metering to look after it, you can go to a manual setting. You would pick your priority at this point, or maybe two of them. If you want to say that I need to have a certain shutter speed, then I'm going to adjust my ISO and my aperture so that I can achieve that. But by adjusting either the ISO or the aperture, you can tell the camera exactly what's most important to you. So if you, say, walk into a concert, let me just get rid of this for a minute. I love shooting concerts. They're just a lot of fun. But you've got backlighting, you've got all kinds of things going on in there. My main thing is I want to get the action of the band. Now, if you're shooting a jazz band or something where the guy's walking around with a giant trombone, or somebody's playing a harp in a classical situation, you're not going to have a whole lot of movement going on, though the fingers may be going quickly and whatnot. It's not like going into a rock and roll situation, say, where you've got a drummer just giving her, or you've got people jumping up and down on the stage, or tossing their heads, or doing whatever. So you have to adjust the camera to accommodate that. And by using manual, you can say, the important part to me is that I get a good shutter speed to capture what it is that I want. If I want blurry drumsticks, I slow the shutter down. But when I slow the shutter down, that means I'm going to either need to close my aperture up a little bit so that it takes in a little less light, or I'm going to have to reduce my ISO so that it captures the light a little bit slower and accommodates my shutter speed. There are many situations, but typically people who shoot in manual have some control over the situation, and of course will have a really good understanding of how their camera works. Again, I mentioned earlier too, I think, that the nice thing about shooting digital is that the settings will all show up on your pictures as you look at them, so you can always go back and reflect on what you've done. I hear another bicycle coming. Well, the bicycles aren't bad. The thunderbolts out here and the airplanes have been really hard to get this done. You can see the lighting has changed quite a bit. Anyway, I hope that really gives you a good understanding of what's going on. A little bit later on, when I get a little more time, we'll sit down and do a video that describes how to make use of the multiple ways to focus your camera, including selecting points, selecting different buttons to use. And as well, we will talk about how your camera meters, whether it be using flash, the TTL or ETTL, your evaluative metering through the camera and whatnot. So anyway, thanks for being with me.